Hi. Hey. Hello. Hi. My name is Mike Nason. I'm a scholarly communications and publishing librarian. Gabe asked me to talk to your class about scholarly publishing and some other things. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to try to be brief. I did a dry run and this came to about 40 minutes. So if you need to put me on 1.5 speed or whatever, just do it. I won't be offended, but I do speak quickly. So I'm concerned that I may sound like some sort of chipmunk or something. And I guess that's also funny and fine. I'm trying to get through stuff as quickly as we can. So anyway, let's move forward. Scholarly publishing. So this is me. My name is Mike Nason. I'm the Scholarly Communications and Publishing Librarian at UNB Libraries. The publishing part is pretty obvious, I think, but it's possible that you're new to the phrase scholarly communications, and that's because most people don't use it. It's not a phrase that a lot of people use. So we'll talk a little bit about what it is before we talk about the publishing part of it. So it basically just means the process by which researchers share or publish the products of their research. That's really all there is to the phrase scholarly communications. It's very general. It could be your research data or presentations or conferences or the actual publications, any of those things. Those are all part of scholarly communications. This is what's known as the digital scholarship cycle, or sort of the research cycle, research life cycle. And almost always the process starts on the far left with the global scholarly community and someone reading a piece of work that came from there. So when you're working as an undergraduate or a graduate student, you read a work, you get inspired, you plan, and then you do your work and you hand in your paper. It looks a little like this, actually. You read a publication, you get an idea related to a class or an assignment, and then you write it, and then you move on with your life. It's basically your standard coming and going. But typically the way it works for people who are in the field for longer is that this thing is more cyclical. So, you would only typically, as an undergrad, read finished products of scholarship. You're assigned or you browse published versions of material. But increasingly, it's common to have access to iterative versions of a publication and its research data. Diligent citations might even allow you to follow research through the conference circuit or through different steps of its publication. And for some disciplines, by the time something reaches its final published version, it's actually completely outdated, and people don't want to use it anymore. So graduate students read more primary research and likely more iterative publications. And obviously faculty are sort of one order of magnitude above that. So there's research data, preprints, working papers, postprints, conference proceedings. These are all things that people share. And any step, there's something you may want to share with people in your community. And that's part of what scholarly communications is about. So there's ideas. People obviously share their ideas at conferences and talks. And then they have a research concept, some sort of plan for what they want to do with their research. And they will share that with their community of practice, and maybe share that with their department or whoever else they need to talk to. They have data and output from the research they've done, and they'll share their research data and say, like, here's the hard numbers from what I did, or here's my notes from the process, or here are my measurements, or whatever. And they share their conclusions, obviously. They share their draft work in preprints, or they share it in working papers or other things. And then they have publications and presentations, and they talk about their work and have their work published, and then they preserve it and disseminate it, and then that disseminated work goes back into the global scholarly community where they read your work, and then you get these impact measures and prestige where people go, oh, you're really good, you research, what a genius you are, you're really great, and here's a good career. So assuming you're looking to enter a career as an academic, either in the short term or the long term, you're going to have to publish or share or otherwise document your work. And since you will also likely have to think about things like citations and impact factors, and I don't think impact factor is real, but we can talk about that when you're older. You also want to promote or share that work in spaces you frequent. There are a million ways to share your work or think about where you're publishing your work. So we're going to talk about some of that here, and we're going to talk about some sort of basics you can carry forward as you start your career in this place. So number one, what's the deal with publishing? I think I want to talk a little bit about this because when I was in my undergraduate degree, I never really talked about publishing. I got sources and I read sources, but I didn't think about how they got to that point or who was writing them or why they were writing them, where the money was, any of these things. So we'll talk a bit about sort of how publishing works. And then we're going to talk about, things we need to think about in the world of publishing in general. So obviously the whole point of scholarship is that for at least some people to see your work and for your work to make some kind of difference. I hope. The research that happens at universities isn't much use if it gets put in a folder and filed away forever. And when you think about it, most publicly funded universities wouldn't be super thrilled if this were the case either. The very purpose of academic institutions is to make the products of research applicable in some way to the world around us and try to help benefit the world in one way or another. This is kind of baked into the role of academia in general. And obviously, it's even better if more people see that work. If as many people as possible see your work and for your work to make some kind of difference. Ideally, your work as an academic will be seen or felt by as many people as possible, at least so long as the way in which they feel it isn't the product of cartoonish supervillainy. I'm asking you not to be a supervillain. Obviously, you don't need to listen to me, but I recommend not being a supervillain. Publishing and sharing research is a hugely important part of an academic career. I really want to stress this because, again, I don't think it's something that universities are particularly good at talking about with their undergraduate students. In general, is that your professors don't just teach classes; they have research and publication expectations. Teaching you is just a fraction of their job, and actually, in the small print, it's probably more important to the way that they're promoted and what their career looks like than teaching is. Teaching is actually pretty low on the scale of the stuff that a lot of researchers care about. Doesn't mean that they're all bad at it. But it turns out it's actually kind of a really subjective thing, and it's hard to evaluate. But how much you're publishing and how big your research is, that's a little bit easier to measure. And it's the stuff that institutions really, really care about. So it's a huge part of an academic career. Your profs aren't just teaching you and aren't just teaching. They are also researchers who publish. I'd like to give you a little bit of advice up top before we dive in. I just want you to understand more than anything that very few things in academia are set in stone. Academia is a conservative place. It's slow to change. But if you ask your instructors, they'll tell you that things are very different than they were even a decade ago. It's okay to try to push to change the status quo, to dig around and make things hard for people. all of that's fine. To make people uncomfortable, it's okay. And not a lot of this stuff is stuck. You may have to push really hard, but you can change stuff. Here are some narratives for navigating different generations in or of academia. I like to talk about this a bit in terms of just, sort of the three general ways in which things will go in institutions. Number one, you will be told things that are ingrained in academia that are very useful to you. Sometimes things are consistent because they're tried and tested. It seems sort of intimidating now, but it's really important for you to know that whatever field you're hoping to enter has its own culture of publishing that you can draw from. And things that people in that field have learned just from years and years of trial and error that they know are consistent. And those things will be useful to you so you don't have to reinvent the wheel or make mistakes others have made. There's sort of beauty in this idea that others have come before you and paved a path. Then similarly, there are things that are ingrained in academia that you can change or ignore or be deeply perplexed by. This happens to me more than other things. This idea you'll, sort of have someone say, well, this is the way we do this. And you go, well, why? Why would you ever? And it's okay to do that too. There's sort of beauty in the unknown. This idea that people will be sort of entrenched and you'll want to try to change those things. And that's kind of the other category of things you'll run into. And then the last one is sort of the idea of newer things. This is a bit related to number two, that your generation will shape in a significant way that you will probably hear sassy things about. It's inevitable that your generation of scholars will forge their own paths or shortcuts. And these paths will be unfamiliar to the established folks in your field. And they will probably be vocal about it in one way or another. There's sort of beauty at the fact that someone is going to yell at you to get off their lawn. I say that because lawns are stupid and you have an opportunity to tell them that lawns are stupid. You'll have sort of an older generation of researchers who will be saying, no research done this way could ever be important. And then you'll say, yeah, it is, shut your mouth. And that's going to feel really good. And people will say sassy things to you for sure, because there's a lot of ego in academia, and a lot of people aren't well trained socially. You have a lot more agency, just sort of overall, than a lot of folks in academia might let on. Regardless of the potential experience ahead of you, this is kind of the only thing I need you to absorb for me. It's actually really important. It's inevitable that someone in your career or field or life will tell you things are just the way they are. This might as well be the provincial model of New Brunswick. But it's good to apply scrutiny, and it's okay to push for change. And you have more ability to shape that change than you may think. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of reliable constants and things that we can kind of generally trust, more or less, the folk wisdom that's useful to people in academia in general. As it relates to publishing. So one, disciplines can have unique cultures of publishing and they can vary greatly. Everybody that you are friends with who are also in school, this is very common, for example, when I did my arts degree, that my friends in engineering and I would make fun of each other for the way that we do work. And they would say, oh, I don't want this big essay. It's really dumb to write. I don't want to write it. He'd be like, come on, you can't write an essay. But then I wouldn't want to do math. And they would make fun of me for not wanting to do math. Disciplines have these sort of unique cultures around the ways that they work, and they also have unique cultures around the ways that they publish and what research looks like and how it's done. And it doesn't mean that one is better than the other or one is the right way to do it. It just means that these are cultural things within these disciplines. And some of the ways that they've changed even over time. So, the culture of publishing has changed for your instructors, obviously since they started their career. For a very long time, authors of a publication could receive a physical copy of their work in the mail that they could put on their shelf, and they were very proud. And most publishers don't do this anymore. In fact, if the library doesn't subscribe to the journal in which an article is published, it's just as possible that the author will have to pay access to the copy of the thing that they wrote. And this change has happened over the last decade or so, but it's non-trivial, right? Like, the idea that you got a copy of this thing and you were part of publication and now you're someone who has to pay to access a thing you wrote, like that's non-trivial. That doesn't feel good. And this change is nothing compared to, say, the wholesale change in the way people communicate now because of things like the internet. So, these cultures are varied and they change over time. We can talk a little bit about individual cultures a bit and how they vary sort of from discipline to discipline. So, for example, on the bottom here, we have journals, short tail, preprints. So in the sciences, research moves really fast. Sort of cutting edge technology requires an expedience in publishing that pushes a field forward as quickly as possible. And some disciplines of physics, for example, by the time articles are published, they're already out of date, as I mentioned earlier. And they churn this work out really fast. So, the research itself happens over the course of a couple months or a year. They write the paper, they send it out, and then as soon as they send it out, they're working on another project. In the humanities, though, research can take way longer to work on. People can be working on a monograph for 2 or 3 years or more. And this means two, not only does it take longer to write, but ideally the contents of a historical monograph will likely be relevant for a longer time, and also that it will take sort of a longer time for that work to be outdated or made irrelevant or challenged by other scholars. And that work sort of has a what we refer to as a longer tail. So there's sort of expedient, fast work that builds on iterative research in a quick way. And then there's monographs which sort of build on more broad narratives and require a lot more effort from people. But we also have things like technical reports, proceedings, research data, software codes, and lots of other new kinds of material that are also ways in which people disseminate their work. Technical reports are pretty common in engineering and applied sciences. Conference proceedings obviously are tied to conference presentations and papers one reads at a conference. Research data is the data behind your work that is now increasingly its own kind of material that has its own citations and its own impact and can be shared to other people. Software and code, similarly, especially if you're writing, say, open source code, that work goes out to a community and that thing grows and becomes its own thing. And then obviously there'll be new ways that people share work that I don't even know about yet, or could be tomorrow or it could be generations from now. What's important is that you remember that publishing, like research itself, is not monolithic. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse a little bit, but I really just want you to do your best to not assume that the way you do research is the way everyone else does it. If there's a faculty member who has a neighbor next door who publishes predominantly open access, and we'll talk about that later, they may hate that. They may think it's really dumb, but no researcher has monopoly on what research looks like or should look like. Publishing is about submission, rejection, peer review, rejection, ego, and prestige. This is more or less a universal. It's no coincidence that rejection is here twice. It's really important to know that publishing itself and academia kind of in general is an exercise in rejection. You don't get this sense in an undergraduate degree, but you certainly do when you're a graduate student. You certainly do once you start submitting papers to journals. I think the most important thing I need you to know is that the way publishing works is that people send their work to journals and then they're peer reviewed by people and then they're either accepted or rejected. journals don't read someone else's work independently and then reach out to them and say, I think you're a genius and we want the next thing you do. That's not how that works. And we're going to talk about this a bit further. But it's really about submitting to journals and then, building on sort of a history of rejection and moving forward with that and learning from it. And the impacts of those things on somebody's ego and the impacts of those things on your prestige as a researcher. So the number one question I get from people, either as a librarian helping people with a resource or as a librarian helping people figure where to publish is this journal good? Or how do I know that a journal is good? It may not be obvious to you, but one of the ways that researchers determine the value of a journal or how great that journal is how high the rejection rates are. So if a journal has a really high rejection rate, you go, boy, I really want to get published there. It's kind of exclusive. And I can also look at things like journal metrics, how often that journal is cited, or how often how often papers in that journal are cited. These are things called like impact factor and other metrics. I can also take the apply patience and effort to get a sense as to whether or not this place publishes work that I'd be proud to be included in. I think that's sort of a big part of it, is sort of finding the journals that you want to read that are related to your field, and you do that over time, maybe getting a subscription and reading all the articles in an issue. If you find a couple journals that are specific to your field of practice, sort of keeping up to date with those things. And then realizing the places you're citing are publishing in, and thinking a little bit more about what work comes from what place. And all of that's built out of experience. So, obviously when you're an undergrad, there's a level of scrutiny you learn to apply. When you're coming up through your undergraduate and graduate degrees, you're often tasked with establishing the quality of the source. You want to make sure you're getting your information from an authoritative researcher or because of rigorous methods. And this also applies to figuring out where to publish. Information literacy doesn't stop at sorting out which journals are trustworthy. So it's important to know, like off the jump, when anybody gets started trying to figure out where to publish, they're probably not going to have much of an idea where to look. And that takes time. And you do have to kind of dig around and sort these things out. And there's no, not knowing where to publish isn't something to be ashamed of or worried about. Everybody kind of starts in that place. And again, not only does everybody kind of start in that place, not often do we talk about whether or not it's easy to find that information. But the best part is that someone has been in your shoes and will have relevant information for you. I don't know about Zoomers, but millennials, hi, I am one, have a reputation for not liking to ask for help or not liking to pick up a phone or bother people with questions. And it's really hard for some people to ask for help. But I'm here to tell you that you'll learn something about publishing or anything really faster if you ask folks about it. I've included a quote from a favorite podcaster of mine: ask smart people dumb questions. Never be ashamed to ask somebody a question you think is stupid. The worst they could do is not answer it. And honestly, if they don't, then they suck and you don't need to worry about their opinion anyway. Someone has been in your shoes. There are people who have done the things that you have done. They may not be teaching you that thing, but they've certainly come in contact with it. So who can I ask for help? So many people. You can ask me if you want. You can ask a librarian at whatever institution you end up at down the road. There's either disciplinary librarians who work in your field, who know the resources, or there's people like me who work in sort of the publishing side of things and understand how publishing works. Any of those people are happy to help. Honestly, anybody in a library is just thrilled you're talking to them, so they all want to help you a ton. You can also ask your community of practice. Community of practice is just the community of folks in your field with whom you regularly communicate. If you are, say, an anthropologist, this might be an association of anthropologists. It might be a mailing list or a listserv or whatever. It might also be a subgroup of just archaeologists. You won't have just one, but they're often supportive and know things that you won't. You can also ask other students, instructors, advisors. You can even ask your departmental secretary, and I guarantee you they'll know something because they are wizards. You just want to make sure that you're talking to the people around you. Almost anybody who is established in academia in one way or another, or even clawing at getting established, has learned something that's probably going to be useful to you in one way or another. You are supported, but you will have to be okay with asking for help. If there's anything I've learned in this space, it's that people are not offering this information, and I don't really know why. I think because it's kind of accepted. Again, we talked about whether or not accepted things are worth pushing back on, that everybody just kind of has to figure this out for themselves. But people will help you when you ask. Early career academics are under a lot of pressure. I'm kind of hesitant to talk about this aspect with a lot of early career folks. I don't like to discourage people from, following a path they want to go down. But everything related to the research cycle in modern academia is harder than it was generations ago. And there are some real things to be concerned about, the sort of like neoliberal bubble of academic institutions and how they treat their faculty and how they treat staff. I'm not saying UNB is bad, but things have skewed in a direction. So, there's already this idea of baked in pressure to publish, and people know the phrase publish or perish. And it doesn't necessarily mean, I think people mean like you'll get fired, which probably isn't the case, but you will become less and less relevant in your field if you're not publishing. But also, faculty are under increased course loads in a general effort from universities to get more butts in seats. They're teaching more. And as I mentioned, they don't only teach. Their research requirements aren't going down, but their teaching requirements are going up. When you think about how full a dinner plate is, it's like they're saying, well, this food has to make up this much more of the plate, but we're not going to clear anything else on the plate off. So there's more and more pressure to teach more classes. And then on top of that, they obviously have to do their individual research. They have to think about their own professional development. Still, they have to do committee work and service. And then there's this extra narrative of people like sessional faculty. So it's pretty common for undergraduates in particular to refer to everybody who teaches them as a professor. But professor is like a rank at an institution, and there are lots of people who teach you who aren't professors at this institution. They're probably sessional instructors, stipend instructors who are trying to get teaching experience while trying to pull together enough of a CV to get a permanent position somewhere else, maybe here, maybe another place, because these jobs are very competitive and there are less and less sort of tenure track positions available in the first place. So there are a lot of people teaching for very little money that I would describe, actually, most sessional faculty kind of get paid a wage I would describe as exploitative, while trying to do all of these other things. They're probably on a committee or two. They're trying to do professional development. They're trying to crank out research and get published. And they don't have the benefit of even being full-time employees at a place. I don't say these things to stress folks out or be discouraging, but it's important that we be transparent about the fact that a career in academia, though often a product of privilege, is not often easy or relaxing. Obviously there can be harder jobs. Having to write and think for a living could be much worse. But it doesn't mean that this is easy or stress-free. There's a lot of pressure on academics. And I think it's important to note that your time is finite, and so is your attention. So it's important when you're in this space to have kind of a grasp on your own personal and professional boundaries. When you're willing to work, are you willing to take downtime? Basically trying not to get burnt out and acknowledging that you can't know all of this stuff from the beginning, and not beating yourself up over it. Sometimes it's the system that's flawed, not the folks trying to live up to it. I think that's important to remember. And this is one of the things that as an academic you can kind of push back at, is the ways in which the system isn't great for the people who are in it. I do a lot of this, and I'm pretty junior in my position, and it's okay to do. Number 4, academic publishing is a hugely lucrative industry. Oh, great, it's capitalism. Money plays a huge role in the narratives of publishing, in a major way. And this probably isn't too surprising because money also plays a huge role in research. But I think it's easy to discount because you've heard for years, newspapers going bankrupt, less people reading magazines or whatever. But the academic publishers actually make a ton of money. The top 5, are all well into profit margins, and they all do very, very well because universities are a bit of a captive audience, right? They need access to the material. They have large budgets, and researchers can't be researchers without access, and students can't be students without access. So there's a lot of money to make in publishing. This is what publishing looks like from a payment or labor perspective. You can see here universities pay researchers to write in the top left, review and edit works, and publishers then sell that work back to institutions. So the university pays the researchers, top left, the researchers do the research. This is all standard. Sometimes they have a grant to help with research costs, but they're being paid, they're salaried to do their research. Those researchers then submit an article that they wrote, again, sort of on the clock, and then publishers assign reviewers. Reviewers are also faculty members and researchers. So the researchers do the review, the peer review, and make sure that the work is all acceptable, and they return it back. And then an editor for that journal decides whether or not that thing is getting published, and they're probably also a researcher. And then the publishers publish the material, and then the university buys access to the finished content again. So the university is paying for the researchers to research. They're paying for them to write the content. They're paying for them to do the review. They're also paying for some of the work they do as editors, and then they're paying to buy the content back. And for a non-trivial amount of money, UNB's collections budget's like $2 million. That's a lot for people to pay. So we're spending money at almost every step, and then we're being charged a lot to get the research back on the other side. So that's going to lead me to talk a bit about issues and politics and ethics. And I mean, we kind of been talking about this already, but some specific topics that we'll try to get through as quickly as I can. And I'll note that my notes are on the right-hand side and they'll be available in the slide deck too. So if you just want to skip ahead or skip an issue you don't really care to listen to, you can read the notes that are included and hopefully they'll cover everything for you. So publishing has changed dramatically in the last 2 to 3 decades. This is obviously a thing. For one, there used to be a time without this internet thing. It really shook up the way in which work was disseminated. One way to think about this is kind of like how your parents or grandparents talk to you about something like TikTok. Imagine that sort of social rift, but with the technology around publishing, which, as I mentioned, very important to people. So they have strong opinions about it. And ways in which they have done things for a generation, and they don't understand the sort of new methods of sharing material or publishing. And that's just 1 or 2 generations removed. And it even happens, multiple generations within a single department, and they can all have very strong opinions. And actually, usually scholars have strong opinions. So publishing has really changed in a big way. And if you want to have a bit of levity, you can think about your grumpiest professor doing dance challenges on TikTok, and that might put a smile on your face. And then imagine them having to do that in order to get tenure and how angry it would make them. So then open access. So we talked a bit about the money piece of things, and open access is kind of a response to that. It's a response to rising costs in journals and growing passion around making publicly funded research available to that same public. I don't know if you've ever tried to access a resource the UNB doesn't subscribe to, but you are trying to get access to the content. It'd be really handy for you to be able to see it, but it's behind a paywall. And now imagine that, but for the vast majority of scholarly publications. Most members of the public don't have access to the range of things that you have access to. On campus, the library makes it look pretty easy. Like you can do a Google search for stuff, and our resolver puts a link in for you. So you think most stuff is just available freely on the internet. It really isn't. A lot of this stuff comes at a tremendous cost. But now imagine that you're a practitioner in an evidence-based field who doesn't have or can afford access to current research. If that research is behind a paywall, you may be missing out on things that are really important to your career, and you don't have 20 grand a year to spend on a couple journals that can get you things to keep you up to date. Open access is really about breaking down the barriers to access and research sharing globally. It's about this idea of the commons, what we can do with open knowledge that is disseminated to everybody freely so that people can build on that work and sort of, improve knowledge globally, not just for schools where people may not have high budgets, but also communities, where somebody just wants to read a little bit more about a thing and not have to spend $50. I think, the more open education is, the more people can engage in education, and the better off kind of everybody will be. But open access is also hugely divisive. For some disciplines, it's kind of a no-brainer. Physicists and mathematicians share products of research faster, and that means they can work more iteratively. There's more access to materials. But for folks in the humanities, it can feel like a spectacular devaluation of an extensive work. If I take 2 or 3 years out of my life and then someone says it should be open access, it feels like you're saying it should be free. And a lot of the attitudes around the ethics of open access are wrapped up in this sort of why buy the cow narrative. There's this valuation of free materials. How good can they be if they're free? Ask folks who have been led to believe that something can only be valuable if it requires liquidity. This idea, and this is how publishers really push back. They go, well, that version's free, but this version comes with all of these added features. We had an interesting case this summer where the publisher ProQuest tried to double our ebook costs. They had an ebook package and they said, yeah, this is 100% cost increase. And we were like, no, you can't do that. And they said, well, but we made these quality of life changes to the books. We've made these books better. But they didn't change what was in the book, but they were charging twice the amount because of the things that they did to the books that they didn't write. And this is not uncommon with publishers to sort of do this stuff. So open access is about kind of taking that back and saying, you know what? No, this is going to be open to everybody. And we can work on this stuff together. because the internet is a place where a lot of folks are looking to make a quick buck through exploitation or gullibility of others, there's a subject of what I typically refer to as deceptive publishers, but are also known as bad faith publishers or predatory publishers. I don't love the phrase predatory in this case, but it does make a little bit of sense. This is a huge topic. What's important to know is that it's really easy to make a website that looks like research might be published on it. And since a lot of researchers are under that pressure that I talked about, they don't always apply significant scrutiny to the places they think about publishing. And the reason they exist is really simple. They want to make a little bit of money as quickly as possible. They'll promise things like fast peer review, quick publication. You pay a submission fee to the journal, and they will probably actually publish something, but they probably won't peer review it or copy edit it or really think much about it at all. And they will take that money and run. There's a broad spectrum here. Some things are considered predatory that are actually just very low quality. But the most important thing for you to know is that a publisher who only takes your money to upload a PDF to a web page isn't actually a publisher. And as we discussed before, journals don't solicit. So no matter how flattering the email they sent you might seem, no journal is going to write you to say, we read your thesis and we think you're a genius and we really want your work. There's just no universe where that's going to happen. And that's really where they end up roping a lot of people. A lot of early career researchers who are under pressure to publish get an email from one of these. They don't really know about them. And they go, well, I really need to be published. I'll roll the dice. And then there's a fee. They say, yeah, for $500 for your submission fee, you'll get fast peer review. And they're like, well, I don't really have $500, but I really need to get published. And they'll pay the money. And it sucks. But it is what it is. So just sort of, keep your head up and try not to be tricked by these things, and apply scrutiny wherever you're looking, moving forward. Copyright is obviously a big issue. It's another thing I think a lot of folks, especially from prior generations, don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about. The very idea of owning your work. I think for a lot of people, they publish and they just assume that they own their work, but the vast majority of the time, they sign that ownership over to publishers. It's very common for researchers to sign their copyright over when they're published. And this usually means that they don't actually own their work anymore. They have to ask permission to use it elsewhere from this sort of middleman distributor. It's true that when it comes to publishing in monographs, it's a little bit different. People kind of have a more reciprocal relationship with a monograph publisher. Like they have a parasocial relationship with their editors, for example. But generally speaking, there's more and more of a push to keep copyright with the creators of content, and this idea that your work should belong to you. It's still very much an uphill battle, but I think it's important to know that it's okay to say, I really would rather keep my copyright and not just automatically sign it over to a publisher, so that they own your work in perpetuity moving forward. And that's really what's been happening. I'd say 95% of the publications that have come out of, say, UNB in the last 50 years aren't owned by those researchers. They're owned by the publishers who published it. And that's not great. We're also going to talk very briefly about scholarly profiles and social media, and then I will try to get out of your hair. Traditional social media can be a great place to share your work. And it's worth noting, obviously you don't only share through publishing, right? You share through all kinds of other places. Social media can be great, but it can also be awful, especially lately. And what's more, some startups have created social networks specifically for academics that leverage the selling of data the same way that Facebook does, specifically ResearchGate and Academia.edu. You may have heard of either of these, but both of these things are startups with venture capital funding that will need to have some sort of monetization plan. So they do that through ads, and they do that through selling data to people about the way that you use the system, what you've clicked on, how you publish, where you're publishing. All of this stuff goes into the system and they sell that data off. That may or may not bother you. Obviously, I use Facebook, even though I think it's probably one of the worst things for human civilization. And similarly, you're going to have this same thing leveraged here. It's just important to know, these are free services, but they do need to monetize it. So the product here is actually you. There's no price, but you're doing all of the work that's making these companies money. And similarly with Twitter, which can be a bit of a pit of despair or not, I have a very valuable sort of Twitter contingent that I use for my own professional development. But most of the time, I engage in other ways. But there are safer bets that are more trustworthy. And if you're sort of the person who cares about ethical consumption, which depending on the day can be a pretty subjective or relative thing, Orchid is your best bet. They're a not-for-profit. They have a very open governance structure. You own that Orchid ID, and you can decide who gets to see it. And there are other places though, like Google Scholar, Scopus, which is obviously a publisher, but they have a pretty good product. There's institutional tools, like what the Office of Research Services has. And then there's places like disciplinary repositories or sort of online community of practice where people share their work with one another or share their research or share their stories. Those are probably safer bets than these sort of broad products. And they're variably respected in each of the fields that you might be in. So let's talk about a few takeaways real quick. Number one, the vast majority of publications do not solicit submissions. Please just know this. That's not how a publication works. You submit, and then you probably get rejected, and then you redo your work, and then you do it again. No one asks for a paper out of the blue. Journal quality is not black and white. A journal isn't necessarily great or bad. Off the jump. There's lots of reasons that people may publish in the places they're publishing. And sometimes people publish in a place because they're under the gun, and it's not even necessarily a statement on the quality of that researcher. This is all gray area, and it's changing a lot for people, and changing so quickly that a lot of researchers can't really keep up with what these changes mean for them. So journal quality is something that is flexible and subjective and different for everybody. Your work is yours, at least for now. And I think, fighting for this is really important. So just remember, you own your work until somebody tries to tell you that they own it. Be intentional about where and how you share your work. This is, I think, kind of the overarching theme about all of this is that, if you own your work and you're sharing it with people, just think about, those, whether or not those venues are reliable places for you to share it, or if you're proud to share your work in these places, or if you think it's safe to share your work in certain places. Really, really just think about, instead of just putting things everywhere, make those decisions consciously, and think about where you want to put your time and effort. It's okay to be different. I think this is really important, not just as human beings, but also in the academic space. Again, there are colleagues in your department who will think about research and publication in a way that's very different than you. That doesn't mean that you're wrong or that they're wrong. It's just okay to be different in this space and to approach publishing differently than other people. We don't need to be sort of monolithic about what research and publication looks like. Always apply scrutiny. Again, another good rule. Make sure that if somebody contacts you about something, you double check that they're legitimate. Make sure the journals aren't just full of lorem ipsum nonsense text when you see them. Just apply a little bit of scrutiny and maybe think twice about the decisions you make in this space, just to make sure that you don't trip into a hole, I guess. And then lastly, you're supported and it's okay to ask for help. This to me is obvious. But again, I think it's very easy for undergraduates in particular and graduate students to not really know where to turn about this stuff. And I think, obviously your professors and your department are a good place to look, but also places like the library, or even administration. Sometimes, people are invested in you getting the most out of your education, and you are supported in that space. And it is okay to ask people for help, no matter how frustrated you feel. No one is going to judge you for being frustrated, and it's okay to ask for help. That's it for me. I'm including a link to my email address here. You're going to have somebody talking to you, I guess, this Friday, I think, about these things. And so if you have any questions, they'll be able to answer, or you can send me a question directly, or maybe we can have a Teams meeting or something. And Gabe also will be able to answer, I think, some of these questions. So thanks for paying attention if you did, no matter what speed you watch this at. I'm glad to have had a moment to talk to people. And I hope you're okay, because I know I'm barely holding on by a thread. I think that's probably pretty common. So, best of luck and thanks.